Diana Carter was 40 years old, living in Minneapolis, a place where the cold never really left you, no matter how long you stayed. The night she gave birth to her daughter, her husband's plane went down. That was the story she had been told. That was the truth she had lived with for 20 years. She never saw a body. She never got a final goodbye. Just a phone call, a quiet voice, and a life that changed in a single night. She raised her daughter alone, built everything from nothing, and never once looked back, not at her past, not at the family who had already erased her, and not at the man she believed was gone forever. But last Friday, everything broke. Her daughter walked through the front door, pale, shaken, holding her phone like it meant something she didn't understand yet. She didn't sit down. She didn't even take off her jacket. She just said, "Mom, today I met my dad." For a second, Diana didn't react, because there are sentences your mind refuses to process, no matter how clearly they're spoken. Then the phone was in front of her, and the moment she saw the face on that screen, something inside her didn't just crack. It collapsed. Because the man in that photo wasn't a stranger. He was the man she had buried in her memory for 20 years. And, somehow, he was still alive. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. I really want to know how far this story reaches. And if stories like this pull you in, don't forget to like the video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. 20 years earlier, everything Diana had built finally felt like it might last. She hadn't always had that feeling, not even close. Growing up, she had learned very early what it meant to be invisible inside your own home. Her parents had a way of speaking to her that made everything she did seem smaller than it was. And no matter how hard she tried, it never measured up to her older sister, who was always praised, always chosen, always enough. Diana was the one they compared, corrected, and quietly dismissed until the day she stopped trying to belong at all. She left without asking for permission, without a plan, carrying nothing but a small bag, and the certainty that staying would slowly erase her. For 5 years, she lived on her own, working whatever she could find, learning how to survive without expecting anyone to care if she failed. During that time, her family stopped calling, stopped asking, and eventually stopped acknowledging her entirely, as if she had simply disappeared from their lives. And in a way, she had. When she met Ethan Brooks, it didn't feel dramatic or sudden, just unfamiliar in the best way. He's listened when she spoke, remembered things she mentioned once, and never made her feel like she had to compete for basic kindness. It was the first time she experienced something steady. Something that didn't come with conditions attached. Their life together wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she had finally stepped into something that wouldn't be taken away. When she found out she was pregnant, the fear came first, sharp and immediate, but it didn't last. Ethan was there, calm, certain, already making plans in a way that made the future feel possible instead of fragile. They talked about names, about small things like where the crib would go, about how different everything would be once their daughter arrived. Those conversations became the center of her world, something she held onto during long days and quiet nights, something that made her believe she had finally built a life that couldn't be undone. Overnight. On the day she went into labor, he wasn't with her. He had taken a flight for work, something routine, something neither of them thought twice about, because he had promised He would be back in time. He called her, more than once, that day, his voice, steady, telling her to wait for him, telling her everything would be fine. She believed him because she had no reason not to. The call that came later didn't sound like anything important at first. Just another number she didn't recognize. Another interruption in a day that was already overwhelming. But something about it made her answer, and the moment she heard the voice on the other end, everything shifted in a way she couldn't control. The explanation was short, controlled, almost too calm for what it carried. There had been an accident. The aircraft had gone down. There were no survivors. She didn't argue, didn't ask questions, didn't even understand how to react, because at the exact same time, her body was pulling her into something else entirely, something immediate and unavoidable. Within minutes, she was surrounded by movement, by voices, by urgency. By urgency that had nothing to do with the call she had just received. Pain took over, sharp and constant, forcing her forward while everything else in her life collapsed behind her. By the time it was over, the room had gone quiet again. But nothing felt the same. They placed her daughter in her arms, small and alive and completely unaware of what had just been taken away. And Diana stared at her without knowing how to hold both realities at once. The man who had promised to come back was gone, and the life she had just begun had already lost something it would never get back. In the days that followed, there were explanations, official words, statements repeated by people who had never met him, all of it delivered in a way that left no room for doubt. They said the crash had destroyed everything, that there was nothing left to recover, nothing that could be returned. For a brief moment, that absence created a space for questions she didn't want to ask, a thin possibility that something hadn't been confirmed. But time moved quickly, and those thoughts faded under the weight of everything she had to carry alone. The years that followed were not something Diana ever tried to explain. Life didn't pause to give her space to process anything. It simply moved forward, demanding decisions she wasn't ready to make. She left the hospital with a newborn in her arms, and no one waiting for her outside, no family to call, no one asking how she would manage once the reality settled in. The apartment she returned to was small and quiet, the kind of place that held sound in a way that made every movement feel louder than it should. At night, when the city slowed down and the streets disappeared under layers of snow, the silence pressed in harder, and she learned quickly that there was no one else coming to share the weight of it. She took whatever work she could find, starting with late shifts that didn't ask questions, and daytime jobs that paid just enough to cover rent and groceries. Some weeks blurred together into a pattern of exhaustion, where sleep became something she negotiated with rather than relied on. And there were moments she stood in the middle of the room, unsure of how she had made it through the previous day. But she never allowed herself to stop moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant going back to a place she had already decided she wouldn't return to. Her daughter grew up in that rhythm, not knowing anything different, not questioning the absence that had shaped their lives from the beginning. Diana made sure of that. She kept things simple, gave only the version of the past that was easy to carry, and avoided anything that required more explanation than she was willing to give. There were no stories about extended family, no visits during holidays, no sudden phone calls that interrupted their routine, just a quiet consistency that she built carefully over time. As her daughter got older, the questions came in ways that were harder to redirect. They weren't constant, but they were precise, asked, at moments when Diana wasn't prepared to deflect them with a short answer or a gentle distraction. She would pause, choose her words carefully, and offer just enough to satisfy the surface of the question without opening anything deeper. It worked for a while until it didn't. There were small changes that she noticed, but didn't address immediately. Shifts in behavior that didn't have an obvious cause. Like the way her daughter started watching people more closely in public or lingered on conversations that had nothing to do with them. Deanna told herself it was normal. Part of growing up. Part of forming an identity that didn't depend entirely on the person who raised you. Still, there were moments that stayed with her longer than they should have. Moments that felt like something was moving beneath the surface in a way she couldn't fully see. One evening, after a long day that had stretched further than expected, she found her daughter sitting at the kitchen table with her phone face down. Not scrolling, not distracted, just sitting there in a way that felt intentional. When Diana asked if everything was all right, the answer came too quickly, too controlled, as if it had been prepared in advance, rather than formed in that moment. She didn't push further. Not because she wasn't curious, but because she had learned that forcing answers rarely led to anything honest. Instead, she let the conversation shift, let the moment pass, and returned to the routine that had kept them stable for so long. But something about that pause stayed with her, not as a clear warning, but as a subtle change she couldn't quite define, like a detail that didn't fit, but wasn't obvious enough. To question out loud, last Friday didn't feel important at first. It started like any other day, quiet and predictable, the kind of day Diana had built her life around, where nothing unexpected ever forced its way in without warning. She was finishing up work at home when she heard the front door open, followed by footsteps that didn't match the usual rhythm she had come to recognize over the years. There was something slower in the way her daughter moved, something measured, as if every step had already been thought through before it was taken. When she looked up, she immediately noticed the difference, not in appearance, but in the way her daughter held herself, tense without showing fear, unsettled without saying why. She didn't ask right away, waiting instead for the moment to reveal itself naturally, but the silence stretched longer than it should have, turning something ordinary into something she couldn't ignore. Her daughter walked into the room and stopped a few steps away, still holding her phone, not using it, just gripping it like it carried weight beyond what it was. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't match her expression. Calm on the surface, but unsteady underneath, like it had been held back for too long. She said she had met someone earlier that day, someone who had approached her outside campus, not in a way that felt random, but in a way that suggested intention, like he had been waiting for the right moment to speak. Deanna listened without interrupting, but her attention sharpened immediately, every detail starting to matter more than it should have. The description was specific in ways that didn't feel normal, not just about what he said, but about what he seemed to already know. He had called her by her name without asking, had spoken about things no stranger should recognize, details about her life that weren't public, things that had never been shared outside their home. That alone would have been enough to raise concern, but it wasn't the part that made the room feel smaller. It was what came next, the sentence that shifted everything from unusual to impossible. Her daughter said he claimed to be her father. The words didn't land. All at once, they settled slowly, like something her mind refused to accept even as it heard them clearly. Deanna didn't react immediately, not because she didn't understand, but because reacting would have meant acknowledging a possibility she had already buried years ago. Instead, she focused on what could be explained, what could be rationalized, trying to find a version of this that made sense without changing everything she believed. But her daughter didn't wait for that. She stepped closer and unlocked her phone, her hands steady in a way that didn't match the situation, as if she had already crossed the point of doubt on her own. The screen turned toward Diana, and for a brief second, nothing registered, just an image without meaning, a face without context. Then recognition followed, immediate and undeniable, not built on memory alone, but on something deeper that didn't need confirmation. The man in the photo was older, the lines on his face sharper, his expression different from what she remembered. But it didn't matter. There were things that didn't change, things you recognized even when time had altered everything else. Diana didn't reach for the phone, didn't move closer. She just looked. Her attention locked in a way that blocked everything around her. Her daughter watched her carefully, waiting for a reaction that didn't come, not because there was nothing to feel, but because there was too much of it all at once. When Diana finally spoke, her voice was controlled, steady enough to hide what was happening underneath, but not strong enough to dismiss it entirely. She said it wasn't possible, that there had to be a mistake, something misunderstood, something that could still be explained if they looked at it the right way. But even as she said it, the certainty she had lived with for so long didn't feel as solid as it once had. There was something in the image that didn't align with the explanation she had accepted years ago, something that created a gap she couldn't ignore no matter how much she wanted to. And for the first time since that night, she didn't just feel disbelief. She felt something else beginning to take its place, something quieter but far more dangerous, the kind of thought that didn't disappear once it formed. That evening, the house didn't feel like it belonged to her anymore. The air inside had shifted in a way Diana couldn't explain, like something had already entered before the door was ever opened. She sat in the living room, not waiting, not preparing, just holding herself still in a way that felt deliberate, as if any movement might make what was coming more real than it already was. When the knock finally came, it wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to draw everything in the room toward it. Her daughter moved first, quicker than expected, crossing the space with a sense of urgency that didn't leave room for hesitation. The door opened, and for a moment, nothing happened. No words, no sudden reactions. Just the quiet confirmation of something Diana had already seen, but still refused to accept. Then he stepped inside. Ethan Brooks didn't look the same, but he didn't look unfamiliar either. Time had changed the details, the lines around his eyes, the way he carried himself, the slight hesitation in his movements. But none of that was enough to make him a stranger. Deanna didn't stand up, didn't move closer. She stayed where she was, her attention fixed on him in a way that made everything else in the room disappear. He spoke first, using her name like it still belonged to him, like it hadn't been separated by 2 decades of silence. She didn't respond, not because she didn't hear him, but because she needed him to continue, to say something that would either confirm what she was thinking or give her a reason to reject it entirely. He took a step forward and began explaining, not hesitantly, not searching for words, but with a clarity that felt prepared, like something he had repeated enough times to believe in himself. He said. The crash had happened exactly as she had been told. But what followed had not. He survived, not by chance, but by circumstances he described as complicated, involving people who had no interest in reporting what they found. According to him, he had been pulled into a situation tied to financial dealings that had already begun before the flight, agreements he claimed he didn't fully understand at the time, agreements that became impossible to walk away from once things went wrong. He said he had been advised, pressured, then ultimately forced into disappearing, into accepting a version of events that allowed others to resolve what they needed without interference. His voice stayed controlled as he spoke, measured in a way that avoided emotion, focusing instead on details that sounded specific enough to feel credible. He explained that returning had never been an option, that doing so would have exposed him to consequences he couldn't manage, that staying hidden had been the only way to survive what he had become part of. Diana listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharpened with every sentence. There were parts of his explanation that fit together too neatly, parts that answered questions she hadn't asked yet, as if he had anticipated exactly where her doubts would go. Her daughter stood closer to him now, not fully beside him, but not distant either, caught in a space between belief and uncertainty that shifted with every word he said. When he finally paused, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with everything he had left out. Diana let it sit there for a moment before speaking, her voice calm, steady, but carrying a precision that cut through the version of events he had just presented. She asked him about things he hadn't mentioned, details that didn't align with what he was claiming, questions that didn't challenge him directly but made it harder for his explanation to hold its shape. He answered quickly, too quickly, adjusting his story just enough to cover the gaps without fully addressing them. That was when something inside her shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that replaced uncertainty with something far more defined. It wasn't disbelief anymore, it was recognition, the kind that didn't come from what he said, but from how he said it. The man standing in front of her wasn't someone who had been lost and returned. He was someone who had chosen a path and learned how to explain it afterward. The knock came before anyone had time to respond to what had just been said. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't uncertain. It was deliberate, the kind of sound that assumed it would be answered. Deanna turned her head slightly toward the door. Her expression unchanged, but her attention shifted immediately, as if something in that moment had aligned with what she had already begun to suspect, confused. Her daughter looked confused, caught between the man standing inside and the interruption, waiting outside, unsure which direction to follow. When the knock came again, sharper this time, Diana stood up and crossed the room without rushing, each step controlled, each movement measured. She opened the door and found a woman standing there, composed in a way that suggested she wasn't there to ask questions. Denise Harper didn't wait to be invited in, her eyes moving past Diana the moment the door opened, locking on to the man behind her with a focus that didn't need explanation. There was no hesitation in the way she stepped inside, no uncertainty in the way she carried herself, only a clear purpose that made the room feel smaller the moment she entered. A second figure followed closely behind her, quieter, more restrained, observing rather than reacting. Victor Lang introduced himself without raising his voice, his tone steady, professional, the kind that carried authority without needing emphasis. He didn't move further into the room, but he didn't step back either, positioning himself in a way that made it clear he was there for more than support. Denai spoke first, not loudly, but directly, her words cutting through the space without resistance. She asked him why he hadn't told the truth. Not as a question that expected an answer, but as a statement that assumed one already existed. Ethan didn't respond immediately, and in that brief silence, something shifted in a way that confirmed more than any explanation could have. Deanna watched him closely, not looking for denial, but for recognition, the moment when the version he had presented would begin to break under its own weight. Victor stepped forward slightly then, not interrupting, but adding structure to what was unfolding. Explaining that the situation was already documented, that records existed, that the story being told inside the house did not match the one that had been verified outside of it. Denise continued, her voice controlled, but no longer neutral, revealing that the man Diana had known had not disappeared because he had no choice, but because he had created one. The financial situation he had described wasn't something he had been trapped in, it was something he had been actively involved in, a series of decisions that led to significant debt, legal exposure, and the risk of losing everything tied to his name. When the crash happened, it didn't force him into hiding. It gave him an opportunity to step out of his life entirely. According to what had been uncovered, he had used that moment to abandon his identity, allowing the official report to close without contradiction while he established a new one under condition that were difficult to trace but not impossible to uncover over time. Denise revealed that she had met him years after that, under a different name, with a different background, one that had been constructed carefully enough to avoid suspicion until inconsistencies began to surface. She explained that she had not known about his past, not about the life he had left behind, not about the family that had been erased in the process. Victor added that the reappearance wasn't random, that it had been triggered by something specific, something recent, something tied directly to Diana's daughter. A financial record had resurfaced, connected to the original case, involving a dormant claim that had never been fully resolved, one that required verification tied to his legal identity and next of kin. That connection had led him back, not out of regret, not out of any attempt to repair what had been broken, but because there was something to gain that he could not access without reestablishing a link to the life he had abandoned. Deanna didn't interrupt, didn't react outwardly, but everything she needed to understand was already there, laid out in a way that didn't leave space for interpretation. The man standing in front of her hadn't been taken by circumstance. He had stepped away by choice, and now he had returned for a reason that had nothing to do with the years that had passed. No one spoke for a long moment, but everything had already shifted into place. The room felt different, not heavier, not louder, just clearer in a way that left no space for confusion. Deanna looked at him without searching for anything else, because there was nothing left to uncover, nothing left to question. The version of him she had held on to for years no longer existed, and the man standing in front of her had made that undeniable without needing to say another word. He tried to speak, not to defend himself, but to redirect what had already been revealed, shifting his attention toward their daughter, softening his tone, choosing his words more carefully this time, as if that alone could change how they would be received. He said he still had a right to be there, that nothing erased the fact that he was her father, that there was still time to fix what had been broken. But Deanna didn't interrupt him, but she didn't respond either, because she understood something he didn't. This was no longer about what could be repaired. It was about what had already been decided. Son. Their daughter stepped back slightly, creating distance that hadn't been there before, her expression. No longer uncertain, no longer searching for answers that might make sense of what she had just learned. When she spoke, her voice was steady, not raised, not emotional, but clear in a way that didn't leave room for interpretation. She told him that being a father wasn't something you could claim when it became convenient, that it wasn't defined by biology or timing, but by presence, by the years he had chosen not to be there. She didn't accuse him, didn't repeat what had been said. She simply stated what she had already accepted. He tried to respond, but the words didn't hold the same weight anymore. Not everything else had been placed in front of them. Denise didn't move closer to him, didn't offer support, didn't interrupt. She remained where she was, her silence carrying more distance than anything she could have said. Victor spoke briefly then, not to escalate the situation, but to make it clear that what had been uncovered would not remain inside that room. That there were legal consequences already in motion, that the identity he had used, the financial records connected to it, and the actions tied to both had created a situation that would not resolve quietly. Deanna listened, but her attention stayed on the man who had once been the center of a life she had built from nothing. She stepped forward finally, not out of emotion, but out of certainty, closing the distance just enough to make her next words impossible to ignore. She told him to leave, not as a request, not as a reaction, but as a final decision that didn't require agreement. He hesitated for a moment, looking at their daughter again, as if there was still something left to hold on to. But there wasn't. She didn't move toward him, didn't soften, didn't change her expression, and in that stillness, everything he had come back for disappeared. When he turned toward the door, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't forced. It was simply the only direction left. Denise followed after a second, not beside him, not aligned with him, just moving in the same direction without connection. Victor remained long enough to say that someone would be in contact, that the next steps would be handled through proper channels. Then he left as well, closing the door behind him in a way that felt final without needing emphasis. The house returned to silence, but it wasn't the same silence Diana had lived with for years. It didn't carry absence anymore. It carried resolution. She turned toward her daughter, and for the first time that night, there was no distance between them, no uncertainty, no questions about where they stood. They didn't speak immediately, because nothing needed to be explained, nothing needed to be filled in. Everything that mattered had already been made clear. Diana had spent years believing that loss had defined her life, that something had been taken from her without choice. But standing there now, she understood something different. What had shaped her life wasn't what she had lost. It was what she had chosen to keep moving forward with. The decisions she had made when no one else was there to make them for her. Some people don't leave because they have no other option. They leave because they choose themselves over everything else. And, when they return, it isn't to repair what they broke. It's to take something they couldn't have before. That was the part she would never forget, and the part she would never allow back into her life again.